Welcome everybody to today's Wonder Talk. I have the pleasure today to introduce Jacqui McCord, who works for Morphin Environmental, and she's here today to tell us about her exciting work that she does working with streams and rivers. So thank you, Jacqui. I'll hand the presentation time over to you.
Thank you. So welcome everybody. My name is Jacqui and I work as a fluvial geomorphologist at Morphin Environmental. And when I say that, I normally get very blank stares. So fluvial is looking about rivers and geomorphology is the study of formations in the landscape and the processes that make them. So while I look at the landscape mostly around rivers, geomorphology applies to the entire landscape. So that's also the coast and the hill slopes and the mountains. So I look at those as well, but at the moment I'm primarily looking at the river space. So in short, what I do is I look at what a river is doing today, how the river is going to evolve through time, and how that could impact on people, the environment, and property. So rivers are the process of taking water and sediment from the hill slopes and the land down to the sea. So rivers and how they look is all a function of the topography, so how steep the landscape is, the geology, so the type of rock that you've got, as well as the climate, so how much rainfall you have. And how a river looks depends on where it sits within the environment. So if you're in the steep hill slopes, on bedrock, you're more likely to get things like waterfalls and cascades. But if you're downstream in the low-lying plains, then you could get a river which is more like a big meandering snake across the landscape. Or if you've got a river which has a huge amount of gravels, like this one here in the picture, you can get like lots of little mounds of gravel with braided streams weaving throughout them. So the type of streams that you get, or the rivers that you get and what they look like and what features are in them is all a function of where they sit within the landscape and the water and the sediment which is entering them. So by understanding that, I can then start to look at how a river may change if we change the water or the sediment going into them. We are really good at changing our rivers by putting a dam on them or increasing the amount of stormwater that enters them, and changing this will then change how the river behaves, and we could increase things like erosion, or we could stop the river flowing altogether. And this then links into how does those changes affect people, property, and infrastructure. So by understanding first what a river should be doing, assessing how it could possibly change, we can see if we may have increased risk to people, such as flooding or erosion of the river banks. And then through that, we can then look at river remediation. So if we do have a problem, how we can protect the property and people and make sure people's lives are not in danger. So rivers have a really good way of forming their own balance or their own equilibrium. So over time, they sort of sit in an equilibrium position, so they don't build up material, or they also don't degrade and erode through them. So they're at this balance. But what happens is that we change the system by increasing quite often the water that goes into them. So if they've got more water flowing through, they then have a lot more power, and this can increase erosion. They can also flood out more extensively. But the thing is, erosion in a river and flooding are actually natural processes that a river does. So a river will flood to dissipate any increase or high energy. It will flood out, and that will stop increasing erosion of that river. Likewise, if a river is too steep, then what it will try and do is increase the amount of its length of the river. So it will decrease how steep it is to dissipate that energy. So it's going to start to erode banks. So sometimes we may say, well, it's a naughty river, it's eroding or it's flooding. But hang on, this is what a river is meant to do. So we should be living with the river and its natural processes. So a lot of my work is really about looking at a river and finding what that river's voice is. What does that river naturally want to do? And then how can we live better with the river? We have tried to tame our rivers in the past, but they tend to have their own way of doing things, and they will rebel against us and flood out and erode. So the work is all about looking at the river and working best with it and living with the river in its natural environment and trying not to change that natural system. So we have in the past been really bad with the way we treat our rivers. They used to be seen as just drains, which would take water from our cities and our farms down into the sea in the fastest way possible. But that is not how we like to look at our rivers today. And we much prefer to, now it's all about trying to restore back the rivers. So we used to have them with concrete or form them into straightened drains. We'd take away all the like vegetation around them, and they didn't look very nice at all. So now it's all about enhancing our streams and trying to restore back the natural ecosystem. So continuing to, so taking away the pipes, putting back in a natural stream, trying to encourage back the ecology, so the fish or the insects that live in the stream, bringing back the vegetation alongside it. So how the geomorphology links into this is that the type of river or system that's going to be there is a function of where that river sits in the landscape. And then how that river works will also affect what sort of habitat you can have. So it all links into creating a nice new ecosystem, but by first you've got to understand the processes that that river is working under. Cool. So a little about my career story. So I went to Westlake Girls High School and I always liked the sciences. So I continued through with geography, chemistry and biology. I always liked geology basically, so volcanoes and earthquakes particularly. So when I decided to continue on with science, I went to the University of Auckland where I did a Bachelor of Science in Geology, which was for 3 years. So I didn't follow a linear path. So after my Bachelor of Science, I went and did engineering geology, where I was looking at the ground conditions and the landscape and the geomorphology for the purpose of engineering and development of that land. But it wasn't really quite my passion. So I decided I really liked the geomorphology side of it the most. So that's when I decided to make a change and move to more from environmental. And it is absolutely my passion. I love working with rivers. So I've actually gone back to study now, back at the University of Auckland to continue my studies in the geomorphology space. So my most useful subjects were geography and geology, which is all about the earth and the processes that form the earth. But other helpful subjects include ecology, maths, physics, chemistry, so a lot of the other sciences, because the little bits of those also tie in with how with geology and geography processes as well. So while I now do more the geomorphology, the geology background has definitely helped as well and made me such a much better geomorphologist in the process. So this was me on site looking at a river system and the geomorphology and processes happening, but also by what I'm doing here is logging the soils and see what that geology was. It helped to also inform how the river was working. So the key STEM skills that I use every day. So communication is a big one. So that is in many different forms. There's obviously written communication in emails or in the reports we write, which could be for just the general public explaining what we're doing, or it could also be to a high level academic trying to justify why we're doing what we're doing. And it's not just the written, it's also visual communication. So putting drawings and maps together. And then also verbal communication, because we need to sometimes present our ideas to people as well through workshops and presentations. The next one is problem solving. So people will come to us with a problem. A stream is eroding and it's affecting a road. So they need to address that somehow. So we come out, we look at what the problem is and work out the best way to address it, and without causing other issues, because rivers do have a mind of their own sometimes, and if you do one thing, they like to do something else. And that then links on to critical thinking. So sometimes we get shown a problem, but that may not always be the only problem, or it may not be the root cause of what's happening. So we've also got to look outside the box and really look at and understand the whole system and the whole processes of what's going on. And sometimes it's also think of how we can better enhance the overall project, not just the one thing that the client may think they need to address. So one thing I wish I knew at your age before pursuing a STEM career was that science is all interlinked. You don't need to be an expert at everything, but a little knowledge helps. So especially with what I'm doing now, the one subject that would be very useful is actually biology, because the stream is not just the water, it isn't also the life that lives in it, and the stream banks and the whole ecology all creates that river system. But also physics starts to play a role in the way that the water flows and the forces that are acting. Maths was just having to calculate angles of stream banks and a bit of trigonometry and things. So all those subjects help to build up that greater picture of what's going on. So I probably dropped out. Now, if I was in hindsight, I would have liked to have kept up a bit on my physics, which I dropped during the early part of high school. And that was probably the one subject I wished I had just at, even just the high school to a high school level would have been great. And same through my university, I didn't have a broad range of subjects. I definitely focused mostly on the geology and didn't pursue necessarily other sciences as much as I would do in hindsight. So that is my one thing I wish I had known. So that is all about my exciting career in fluvial geomorphology, which I absolutely love. Does anybody have any questions about what I do?